Two combatants spar Hindenburg against the Saar, move in 12 battalions large into a Russian counter-charge. They'll be fighting for their lives as the enemy revives. Russians won't surrender, no, striking fear into their foe.
What just happened?
So every day we get to start a Warographics video with lyrics by Sabaton, but if you know anything about that particular Swedish heavy metal band, you know that they don't go around memorializing just any battle with their music. If a battle makes the cut for their consideration, well, it must have been quite the affair. And so it was at the Battle of Osowiec Fortress, better known as the Attack of the Dead Men. Facing down 14 German battalions, dozens of heavy siege guns, and 30 batteries of artillery, a far smaller force of Russian soldiers would be pinned down, shelled to pieces, and bombarded with chlorine and bromine gas. But against all odds, their desperate counterattack would rout the German attack, as in perhaps the most brutal and death-defying last stand of all time. So, in the opening months of World War I, Imperial Germany unleashed absolute hell on Tsarist Russia. Despite an early enthusiastic Russian push toward German territory in 1914 with the goal of tying up German forces and ending the war swiftly, the legions of Tsar Nicholas II were under-equipped to handle what was coming back at them. At the Battle of Tannenberg in August, the Russian 1st and 2nd armies were nearly entirely destroyed, and after the loss of well over 100,000 men killed, injured, or captured, Russian forces were routed entirely from East Prussia. Just weeks later, another 100,000 men were lost to the Masurian Lakes, and as many as 3 times that number became the casualties of war during a Pyrrhic battle against Austria-Hungary. The start of the war had been nothing short of catastrophic, and almost as punishment for their hubris, the Russians were forced back into a clearly defensive posture. But even despite their rather extreme difficulties trying to go on the offense, the Russians had at least some options for defense. One of these options was Osowiec Fortress, located in what is today the nation of Poland, but was, at that time, territory controlled by Russia. Built over the course of several decades, Osowiec Fortress was located in and around swampland in the Bybrzza Valley. Crucially, it also guarded the only crossing point of the Bybrzza River, which came complete with a major rail line that had already been constructed. Cross the river, and the Germans could go from nearby East Prussia into the Polish heartlands, moving massive amounts of heavy equipment as they did so. But Osowiec Fortress was not an easy capture for the Germans. It was built on difficult terrain, surrounded by bogs and marshes where artillery pieces could easily become stuck, and the nearby river was a natural barrier against encirclement. Not only that, but the fortress was actually made up of 4 separate forts, making it easier for each fort to provide covering fire and support the other 3. World War I was a bad time for any army to be relying on forts for protection. Artillery bombardment was usually enough to level them to the ground. All that was needed was enough time and enough ammunition. But when Germany found their way to Osowiec Fortress in September of 1914, a 6-day artillery shelling wasn't enough to get the job done. Under continual bombardment, the men inside were able to hold out until it became clear to the Germans that they would need more firepower to break through. Their answer was Big Bertha, a truly massive artillery piece that the Germans had been developing in secret since before the war began. A 420mm howitzer with the ability to fire projectiles weighing nearly a ton to a distance of almost 6 miles, Big Bertha had proven more than able to crack open French and Belgian forts on the Western Front, and although the Germans had constructed only 12 of the guns, they deployed a pair of them to Osowiec Fortress during the autumn of 1914. The Big Bertha was an early bunker buster, and its favorite kind of ammunition shell was built to penetrate some 40 feet into concrete and soil before exploding, so as far as the Germans were concerned, the gun would be more than enough to bring Osowiec to its knees. Except Osowiec didn't fall to its knees, not for months and months. Granted, it would be a little generous to say that the fortress withstood Big Bertha's onslaught gracefully. Against this kind of firepower, it took severe damage, and the troops inside could do little except just try their best to hold out. But through the fall of 1914, into the winter, and then into the spring, Osowiec Fortress did not crumble, and the men inside did not capitulate. In March 1915, the Germans tried again to take the fortress, and again they were repelled. Now, this sort of delay had been acceptable during the winter months, when no competent military commander would be so foolish as to attempt to push into Russia, but now, with the year 1915 ready to unfold, Osowiec Fortress was an intolerable barrier to Imperial Germany's hopes of an offensive into Russia. During this time, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg was the guy Germany sent to battle if all other options had failed, and by July 1915, the fortress had proved so painfully intractable that von Hindenburg's presence was required. Now, by this stage of their prolonged battle, Russian forces inside the fortress were badly outnumbered. About 500 regular troops of the 226th Infantry Regiment were in fighting shape inside the fortress, joined by about 400 members of the local militia. And fighting shape is a fairly loose term here. Like in much of World War I, anyone who had enough of their body functioning to hold a rifle was going to have to participate in the fight or otherwise be condemned to certain death. The Germans had no such problems with manpower. At his disposal, Paul von Hindenburg had 14 battalions of infantry, roughly 8,000 men, or that is to say, nearly 10 infantrymen for every one Russian defender of the fortress. He brought 30 batteries of artillery, as well as at least 24 heavy siege guns and an additional battalion of sappers. These are combat engineers who could tunnel underneath the fortress and attempt to get inside from below. By July of 1915, von Hindenburg's attack force was fully assembled, ready and waiting to march on Osowiec. And the Germans also had another trick up their sleeve: poison gas, which had been deployed for the first time in a major battle just a few months earlier in France. Now, the Germans had brought 30 containers of the stuff, and they knew damn well that the Russians had no means to protect against that sort of attack. After all, Osowiec Fortress had been under constant bombardment for nearly a year, long before the Russians or anybody else had known that chemical weapons would figure into this conflict. That meant no gas masks had been delivered, and it's an open question whether the Russians were even fully aware by this point that poison gas had been deployed in the war. The Germans had every advantage, and they knew it. Rather than risk men in an assault, they laid in wait until a day eventually came along where the wind would carry these gases perfectly into the Russian fortress. That day came on August 6, 1915, when in the early morning the Germans began to shell Osowiec Fortress under a heavy barrage of artillery fire. As shells rained down, splitting open new openings into the fortress's outer walls and ripping through the Russians' makeshift repairs, the Germans released all 30 containers of chlorine and bromine gas, and within just a few minutes, the noxious cloud had enveloped the entire Russian fortress, and with it, the Russians inside. Now, in order to understand what happened next, we first got to understand just how much it sucks to be enveloped in a cloud of chlorine and bromine gas. So, to our more squeamish viewers, now's the time to skip ahead, okay? First, there's chlorine, which, when it comes into contact with human skin or is inhaled, reacts with the water inside the body to melt anything it can reach. It will enter through the eyes and destroy the optic nerve. It will enter through the lungs and cause pulmonary edema. And as it travels through the esophagus, it will cause the tissue to tear and dissolve. Bromine somehow manages to be even worse. It burns the skin, eventually to the point that skin can melt off the body. And when it's breathed in, it does the same thing, except moving outward, eating away at the internal organs with nothing the victim can do to stop it. This was the fate of the Russians inside the fortress. Anyone caught outdoors was killed as their lungs dissolve, and the men inside, who had at least tried to put rags over their mouths, were forced to try and use those rags to keep themselves from literally decomposing where they stood. Using wet rags to do that, though, just intensified the effects of the chlorine while doing very little to stop the bromine. The effects were devastating for the defenders. Of the 900-odd men trapped inside, the vast majority were killed, and every man inside was poisoned, even as the fort continued to endure conventional shelling. Over the course of the morning, the Germans unleashed a hell that simply resists comprehension, all but ensuring that nobody would be left to oppose them. So, after the fortress had been so thoroughly bombarded that no meaningful resistance could have survived, the Germans advanced with their near full infantry force. 12 battalions, some 7,000 men, marched on the fortress clad in gas masks and expecting only minimal difficulty. At the most, they'd have to stomach the feeling of putting a few surviving Russians out of their misery, but as the Germans saw it, it was nigh on inconceivable that even the most bloodthirsty Russians would be able to resist. But inside the fortress, some 100 or so Russian defenders were still alive. It's impossible to know what within these men was keeping them from succumbing completely to the gas. Certainly whatever it wasn't physiological. Their skin was horrifically burned or missing completely. Their bodies were in the process of melting from the inside out, and many of them were partially blinded. Maybe it was some sense of duty that kept them from failing completely. Maybe it was something their leader, Lieutenant Vladimir Kutlinsky, had said to rally them against certain death. Perhaps it was sheer desperation, the simple animal urge to seek relief from agony, even when that relief can never exist. But whatever it was enough to get these 100 men standing again, clutching at their rifles and ready to sally out in a counterattack. For all they knew, this was their last stand. But though they were certain to die, they resolved at least to die on the offensive. As the Germans advanced, they began to spot figures in what remained of the poisonous mix. Russian soldiers, some running, some crawling, most of them retching and spitting out pieces of their own lungs, and all of them looking like the first casualties of a zombie apocalypse. They weren't just in ones or twos either. They were attacking in dozens. They were armed, and they should have been dead. Faced with such a sight, von Hindenburg's men did what any person might do. They panicked. At the front lines, the German troops turned and ran with such blind desperation that they trampled those unlucky enough to fall underfoot. Marching in formation in tight quarters, men lost control of their bayonets, slicing at or even impaling the troops around them. With no time to pay attention to their surroundings, many became entangled and trapped in barbed wire. Those who had been told to man trenches left their weapons behind, trying to get away. Those who were running back toward the trenches fell into them. With what artillery and small arms they had left, the Russians opened fire against a force that should have been overwhelming, but had instead crumbled entirely. There's no telling how many Germans died during the Russian counterattack, no records we know of that count them, and certainly no German present was willing to catalogue such an embarrassing list of causes of death. Making matters worse, other German regiments advanced too quickly in the surrounding area, marching headlong into the thickest parts of their own gas clouds and suffering the results. When the Russians ran out of ammunition, they pressed their advantage with bayonets, even after the death of Lieutenant Kudlinski. The Germans had by this time figured out what was happening and began to regroup, killing some of the Russian defenders in the process, but they had little choice but to call a retreat. Those among their number who were thinking with clear heads knew that the remaining Russians would succumb to their wounds in time, and it simply wasn't worth sticking around in the interim. The Germans left the area by noon, and the few Russians left alive didn't stick around long enough to be at Osowiec Fortress when they inevitably returned. Instead, they demolished as much of the fortress as they could, relying on the help of 2 nearby Russian battalions that had not been at the fortress during the gas attack. Against all odds, some of the Russian soldiers and the Polish militia who had survived thus far were actually able to recover from their injuries. One of them, Władysław Strzeminski, had assumed control of the men when Lieutenant Kudlinski had died, and not only did he survive the entire war, but he later became a famous avant-garde painter. On the German side, Osowiec Fortress was eventually found empty, and at least technically captured. This precipitated a much larger Russian retreat from the Polish territories, which the Germans could now move more troops and equipment into than ever before. The lands around Osowiec Fortress would be declared the Kingdom of Poland just a year later in 1916, when Germany and Austria-Hungary attempted to create a puppet state. But before long, Poland was able to become independent at the war's end. Had the Russians and the Polish militia not held out so long at Osowiec Fortress, that land might have been claimed by the Germans up to a year earlier, giving the Central Powers ample time to march on Moscow or set up a well and truly subservient Polish state. But it was thanks to the dead men at Osowiec that the Russians were able to hold out for so long. If not for the defense of the fortress and eventually the attack of the dead men, World War I might have ended very differently. But at the expense of hundreds of Russian and Polish lives and thousands upon thousands of profoundly traumatized German soldiers, Osowiec Fortress will forever remain one of the most legendary last stands in history.